Hello students, good morning to all of you. I am Bhanumati Mishra, Assistant Professor, Department of English, R.A. Mahila PG College, Banaras Hindu University. Today we shall discuss an important phase in the history of English literature called the movement poetry. In order to understand what movement poetry is, we need to see the socio-political scene in Britain in the early years of 20th century. In the history of mankind, the 20th century will forever be remembered as a time of extreme human trauma and unprecedented suffering. This is due to the conflict, and a conflict which not once but twice engulfed the entire world. Yes, the reference is to the two world wars, one which started in 1914 to 1918, and the second which started in 1939 and lasted up to 1945. Literature has its own way of recording history. Poetry in the first part of the 20th century was dominated by the legacy of the Victorian poets, namely Alfred Tennyson, Matthew Arnold, and Robert Browning. Then during the World Wars, we had war poetry by Rupert Brooke, Wilfred Owen, Isaac Rosenberg, and others. These poems were written mostly by people from the trenches and from the battlefields. Most of them were either poets turned into soldiers or soldiers turned into poets. Growing social problems, the rise of extreme right and left-wing ideologies resulted in a very direct political verse in the poetry of the 1930s, and this poetry is called the modernist poetry. This rejected pure aestheticism, and one can see this in W.H. Auden or Louis MacNeil's poetry, and one can understand the modernist thought in the 1930s very clearly. The leading exponent of this modernist movement was, of course, as all of you know, T.S. Eliot, whose Wasteland in 1922 was and is considered a landmark and an iconic poem of the 20th century. The trauma of the post-World War era, the decline of the church, the new awareness of psychoanalysis by Freud, and Marxist political ideology clubbed with the progress in science produced a very different poetry. So you see that the scene of the post-war Britain was bleak with pessimism. Britain by then had lost its superpower status and was bankrupt. Everywhere there was hardship, everywhere there was rationing. Britain had almost come face to face with the crisis identity. Now this harsh realities had taken the place of political idealism. It was an absolute, undoubtedly a time of identity crisis. But the poets of the 1950s had a firm resolve to build a welfare state and a less class-ridden society. Britain had once again decided to take charge. Its poets could not portray the complacency that those that were portrayed in 1930s or 1940s in the pre-war days. Much had changed in terms of society, economics, politics, and of course religion. A radical shake-up was needed. Literature, as they say, needed a change in its attitude. Change as a force in the 1950s literature had its origins in a group known as the movement. Now we come to the topic of today, that is the movement poetry. This was a loose group initially with no clear manifesto or any collective artistic agenda. The poets in this group included Philip Larkin, Kingsley Amis, Tom Gunn, Elizabeth Jennings, D.J. Wright, Donald Davie, John Wayne, Robert Conquest, and this group was primarily English in character, as the Welsh and Scottish poets were not included in this group. It is these 8 poets who were identified as the movement poets. To begin with, they individually tried to reinstate or establish the tradition of the English poetic canon, which according to them was displaced by the modernist poets of the previous 2 decades. The poets in this group did not belong to a particular school or ideology. Each was composing separately without being influenced by the other members. They did not consciously write similar poetry. It was one common thought that brought them together, and that was reflected in the publication of Purity of Diction in the English Verse, written by Donald Davie in 1952. Here, Davie argues that the English poetry should return to the Augustan age of the late 18th century and should treat modernism as an aberration. It should, according to Davy, redefine itself in terms of an older classical tradition which was lost with the death of Thomas Hardy. The title of this group was coined by the literary editor of The Spectator, J.D. Scott, in 1954, and he referred to it as, I quote, "this new movement of the 50s," unquote. The movement produced two anthologies, one by D.J. Enright, edited Poets of the 1950s, that was published in 1955, and Robert Conquest's New Lines, published in 1956. There is also another excellent book written by Blake Morrison titled The Movement, which I recommend to the students. This was published in 1980, and for a detailed study, you must read this book, which has scrupulously been documented, the rise, the brief ascendancy, and the dissolution of this group called the Movement Poets. When we enter the 20th century, all poets tend to become anti-romantic. But the Movement Poets, besides being anti-romantic, were also anti-phony, anti-wet, meaning unsentimental in their approach. Movement poets believed in replacing formal verse and obscure meaning in British poetry. They worked towards rationality and sobriety. The poets were less political in tone and temperament. It's difficult to generalize about the style and content of the movement poets. Any such general statement would always lead and is bound to find an exception. The only commonality that is their dislike for the inflated poetic style of the likes of Dylan Thomas. Big claims are avoided in this. It was the smaller details of everyday life that becomes the subject matter and the themes of their poems. Honesty is of paramount importance in poetry. Besides this, the movement poetry is also ironical, subdued, down to earth, unsentimental, and rooted in realism and contemporaneity. Their language is commonplace and unpretentious. By rejecting the complexities of the modernists, the movement poets helped poetry to reach a wider audience or readership. What makes movement poet different is that he always encapsulates irony and understatement. It's interesting to see how these two irony and understatement are used or combined as two features in the poetry of the movement poets. Movement poetry can be seen as a backlash against the romantic, neo-romantic, symbolist, and obscure poetry of the modernists of the 1930s and 40s. In other words, they rejected cosmopolitanism, experimentation, free verse, and loose structures in poetry. These poets rejected modernism as represented by poets like T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats, Ezra Pound, W.H. Auden, and of course, Dylan Thomas. Philip Larkin and Kingsley Amis are the two most popular poets of the movement poetry who reflect the spirit of this in their poems. They did a great deal in re-engaging poetry with a wider audience. Despite the criticism of not being inclusive, they helped change the course of English poetry for the next 2 decades. It's strangely impossible to understand movement poetry by going through just the background or the biography of these practitioners. Understanding movement poetry is only possible by reading the works of each poet. So I recommend that the students should go through the prominent poems of this time and then listen to this lecture. However, I shall discuss Philip Larkin's 2 poems very briefly. I'll take up a few lines to show the salient features of movement poetry. First, I shall take a few lines from Larkin's poem, Talking in Bed. The lines are, "It becomes still more difficult to find words at once true and kind, or not untrue and not unkind." Now notice the emphasis here is on both truth and kindness, which are important values but rare to find, especially in intimate human relationships. These lines show loss of faith. The lines are rhymed and the language is also simple. This poem, like all movement poems, is devoid of symbolists or Yeatsian influence. This second poem that I have chosen for you is Larkin's Church Going. which is a fine example of the characteristics of the movement poetry. The lines are, "Yet stop I did, in fact I often do, and always end much at a loss like this, wondering what to look for, wondering too, when churches fall completely out of use." This poem opens with irreverence for the church, but ends on a more serious note. It's ironical and understated in tone. Relation between social structure and the church is debated. It highlights the role of church that played in the post-war Britain. It's conversational in style, diction is simple. Notice the first person narrative too. I also suggest that the students should read Larkin's Whitsun Wedding, which again has all the characteristics of the movement poetry. However, Larkins could not adopt all the characteristics of the movement poetry. Hence, he is also called to be in the temperate zone of the movement poetry. Let us now, for greater clarity, summarize the distinguishable characteristics of movement poetry as compared to modernist poets. Firstly, movement poetry embraces a return to form as a reaction against the fragmentation of form begun by the modernists. Secondly, regarding the self, movement poetry offers straightforward representation as opposed to the alienated individual cut off from society and reality as portrayed by the modernists. Thirdly, unlike the modernists who embraced experimentation of form, the movement poets preferred the conventional forms of previously established poetic genres. Fourthly, movement poets don't abandon structure. They embrace formal structure, as did Thomas Hardy. Fifthly, they reflect the reality of the mundane, commonplace, realistic society. It's unlike the metaphor-laced realism of Wordsworth, which is called low poetic diction. They also avoid the high mysticism and high symbolism of Yeats and Eliot. Movement poets strived for plain language devoid of similes or other fancy literary techniques. Finally, it was Larkin who saw the limitation of following in Hardy's footsteps. Gradually, the other poets too deviated from where they began. Ted Hughes' poetry is an example of the emergence of the counterculture of the 60s and the 70s. Hence, the influence of the movement poets slowly declined, and in fact, it took birth in another genre of literature, that is, the English novel of the 20th century.